Okay, greetings, people. I thought what I would try to do today is address an address an absolute classic in communication theory, and partly to do this because it is the centennial of McLuhan's birth. I have here a copy of Understanding Media, and if people have ever tried to look at Understanding Media, it is a very difficult book. It's not only was McLuhan trained in literature and in poetry, and it is, for lack of a better word, it's a kind of complex poem, Understanding Media is. And he employs what he calls probes, these kind of overstatements that are attempting to get people to think about things in certain ways. But I think if you haven't ever read it, it really is something to study. I mean, it's a kind of master work in the nature of technological mediation, the nature of how humanity has in some way separated itself from its natural conditions by instruments of its own making. That's sort of the terms that Burke would use. But I think the larger point here is that Understanding Media, it really is an amazing book. And rather than try to summarize the whole thing, which it does require a certain kind of patience to get through. He demands of the reader a command over history, a command over periods of art, over different styles of literature. You have to have a general awareness of when key events happened in history. I mean, I think so much of it does demand a lot of the reader, but it's also very demanding because he uses concepts and terms that they're playful, they're ambiguous, and I think what I thought I would try to do is, again, if you don't have a copy, get a copy. Go start reading Understanding Media, and we'll see if we can't do a little bit more dialogue here. What I want to do here in this first video is to maybe just talk a little bit about some of the key concepts in the very first couple of chapters. One, I guess the most basic concept throughout the book is that what he says, the medium is the message. It's one of the sort of famous lines from McLuhan. And when he says the medium is the message, it really gets misunderstood. It gets simplified and reduced, and people try to say, well, yeah, if you have the exact same message and you put it through radio, or if you put it through television, or if you put it in a book, it'll be a different message. And that's sort of how they take it. They reduce it to this: the medium has an over dominating effect upon the content, and that's why the medium, quotes, is the message. I don't think you really want to do that. You can try to do it that way, and that's a simple way to try to understand some of it, but it's really not what McLuhan's talking about. I mean, what McLuhan is talking about is the way that humans extend themselves. And that's the subtitle of the book, the extensions of the human, the extensions of man. And when he says extensions, he's trying to get at partly the way that the medium is the message. To say that the medium is the message is to say that, yeah, we are extensions of nature that remake the nature that make us. We create media, and those media extend us, and then it's almost like in extending us, they slide between us and the world and become an environment in their own right. So when we start to see a, a given medium as environmental, that's moving in the right direction. So, rather than seeing, the pen as an object in my world, I start to ask, how am I in the literate world as a result of the pen? See, this is why he says that the user is the content of any media. Yeah, to say that the user is the content is to get at this issue of how are we being technologically extended and mediated through our technologies. Okay, and another meaning of the medium is the message is that, and he has a couple of exceptions, one being light and the other being thought. But he says that the medium is the message because the content of any medium is always another medium. And so if you look at writing, writing carries speech. If you go to radio, radio carries speech. TV carries photograph. Telegraph carries alphabetacy. In each case, we can find some kind of prior media being extended or retrieved, something like this, through this new medium. And so he's partly challenging the way that we think about what is a message and what is a medium. That is, sometimes what we call a medium is actually a multi-leveled phenomena that's kind of a hybrid that has multiple media forms within that medium. If you take the internet, just as an example, I mean, the internet is a very complex medium that carries other media as its content. And to that extent, yeah, the medium is the message, right? It keeps conveying itself. I think maybe the best way, or the more robust way to understand the medium as the message, is to think of the particular characteristics of scale, scope, size, rates of association that get brought in by way of a particular medium. So it has to do with the entire cultural milieu that it's issued out when a medium comes to dominance. And we could talk about the way that, literacy itself created certain patterns of psychological orientations, certain sociological associations, certain ways that people were to relate to one another, certain ways that people could relate to ourselves. Just a simple example would be the drift from shame culture to guilt culture, the way that power, knowledge, and authority gets distributed and centralized and then decentralized to various degrees. Um, I think another way to get at some of this issue of the medium is the message. I mean, if you really get into McLuhan's work, what McLuhan is going to say is that each medium of communication, it extends and amplifies a given sense, whether it's the sense of touch. For McLuhan, as an example, numbers are an extension of touch. That is, numbers not only go back to the fingers and to this tactile sense of counting. I mean, I can close my eyes and I can count the number of rocks in a box, for example. I could dig around. But, social security numbers, they allow people to put a finger on you, to grab hold of you. And so for him, yeah, touch is an extension of the hand. The wheel, even the automobile, the airplane, these are all extensions of the foot for McLuhan. They accelerate it. Speech is an extension of the entire nervous system, right? It allows you to travel over and move around across items with less contact and with greater speed and ease. He has, again, just wonderful discussions of how each medium amplifies and extends not only a given sense, but then alters the ratio balances among the senses. And it is pretty interesting, the different ways that he shakes this out. So it does seem to be that political orientations are related to the kinds of dominant media. That is, the sensibilities that people have about how self-governance should be done, how society should be related to itself internally. These are some function, there's some resonant byproduct of the dominant media. So, is it a text centered culture? Is it a radio centered culture? Is it an internet centered culture? Each one of these, and you can see this in the world right now. I mean, the destabilizing of authority that occurs with the cell phone is really quite significant. The way that the internet is challenging both scientific authority, like when you go to the doctor's office and suddenly you can have the information that previously only he or she had, or just the way that WikiLeaks is right now, disseminating information that previously would have been centralized and would have been very difficult to make available to masses of people. But the internet then is changing our sensibilities about privacy, our sensibility about private property. All of these kinds of dynamics, they're in some way a product of the dominant media, right? A particular medium being the source of the resonance of effects that then echo with a similarity to that medium. Okay, that's the first chapter. Okay, so we're at, and there's only 33 chapters there. We got one in there. The more difficult one to get at, and this is one that's Very important to understand his work. It's his most controversial distinction, and we'll see if I can't flesh this out a little bit. But McLuhan makes a distinction between hot and cool media. Okay, now when he says hot and cool media, I think the first thing to understand is he's being playful and he's being comparative. We don't want to think of any given medium as either hot or cool, just absolutely in some pure and absolute sense. Now you can kind of do that, and we can make that argument in certain ways, but I would argue that that's not going to be that effective, especially not if you really want to understand the text. You need to understand it comparatively, and so any text you could, or any medium, you can sort of say, is that hotter than or cooler than another medium? And we could talk about, well, how would you heat that up? How would you cool that down? And then also you could talk about a given culture. He would use hotted up. A given culture can be hotted up or cooled down by a given medium, and then when a new medium enters, we want to assess whether the hot or cool medium is entering a society that's already been heated up or hotted up or cooled down by prior media. And I'll see if I can give that a little bit more in a second. But the point here would be, for McLuhan, you want to make a distinction. Okay, so a hot medium is a medium that employs a single sense in high definition with a full amount of data, fully saturated data in that one sensory modality, and it's best suited to completed packages. It's best suited to completed packages. A hot medium is generally fragmentary and allows for a one-way acceleration in a kind of direction that hot medium allows for. Now, a cool medium employs multiple senses. It is incomplete. It has insufficient data. It's oftentimes loose and needs to be completed. It doesn't have a completed package, and multiple senses and the sparsity of data itself becomes part of what makes for involvement with the particular kinds of material that medium makes possible. So let me see if I can give a range of some hot media and then a range of some cool media, and then talk about some of those dynamic intersections. Okay, McLuhan begins his book by talking about, after thousands of years of explosion, the Western world is now imploding. And when he's talking about explosion, he's largely talking about the way hot technologies break people out in a specialized way of fragmented, interlocking nature, which is very different than a kind of organicism that preceded it in the oral world, and then the new organicism that's entering in by way of electricity. But okay, let me see if I can go back to the hot and cool media. A hot medium for McLuhan, here's some examples. A hot medium would be print, which for McLuhan, this is a visual media. Television for McLuhan is not. Television is a cool media, and it's actually tactile. It has sculptural values of three-dimensionality and of imagined depth and the ability to touch in a way that this is what he would mean by a visual media. That is, it's something that's there that you're looking at. And again, some of this has to do with the difference between light on versus light through, right? So yeah, for him, light on is a kind of hotting, whereas light through cools it down. It allows for a kind of depth and participation. But so a steel axe would be a hot medium, whereas a stone axe would be a cool medium. Hieroglyphics would be cool, the alphabet would be hot. The waltz, where each person is dancing with a partner to steps that are preset, that's very hot. The twist, where each person gets out there and just wiggles, that's very cool. Radio is hot, TV is cool. See if I can compare why a book is hot for McLuhan and why television is cool. Okay, for McLuhan, a book is hot because it's a completed package. it's fully, accentuating one sense and one sense only, the sense of sight, and it for him, it kind of does your thinking for you. You just follow the sequences there. Now, I think many people want to say, no, that's not right. They want to say, no, the text allows for lots of interpretation. Well, I think we know what you mean, but I think for McLuhan, you want to understand the medium per se. He would say, look, the text does your thinking for you. If you want the example, think of the dictionary or think of the phone book. I mean, it has this order and this ability for you to just go down, look up what something is, and you go, oh, that's what that word means. Or you go, oh, this is what their phone number is, and then you have their phone number. There it is. It's very different than a photo, which, again, for McLuhan, a photo, it actually is fairly hot in a way that a painting is cool. Point, see, the image, God, some of this gets very difficult to deal with because of technological changes that have occurred since McLuhan wrote this. McLuhan wrote this in '64, and it's amazing to think of that when he did, people had no idea what he was talking about. He was dismissed as a crackpot. Today, it looks like the guy had a crystal ball. It's absolutely unbelievable how much he was able to foresee the way the culture was going. And it took 40 years for at least that. It took, more than that, but it took 40 years or so for the Times to catch up with his writing, for people to just see with utter clarity what he's talking about. I think we can all see it. But if you go to, again, why television is cool because you can have a sudden interruption in it. You can be watching TV and they can take a break and talk to you, and you can have not simply a commercial interruption, but the actual program can be interrupted for a news flash or a television show. It allows for a kind of weekly installment and an upgoing, and it's, how do I say it? You're largely just looking at facial reactions on TV. And again, so some of this, we do the comparison. So McLuhan will say that the printed word allowed for surgery. It makes for human beings who know how to act without reacting. That is, you learn how to act in a detached way, because that's part of what the medium does. The medium helps you make your own words sit still, and you can get a kind of quiet, reflective distance upon your own words, which has its own effect upon us, its own effect upon how we relate to our emotions. So says McLuhan. And the argument would be that TV, on the other hand, allows for reacting without acting. And that is, what do we react to? Well, it's other people's reactions. It's just a lot of reactions to facial expressions, but it's very cool in its dynamic. Now, radio for McLuhan is hot. Radio is a hot medium because it only amplifies the sense of ear, and it's really well suited to completed packages. That is, baseball plays really well on radio, but football plays really well on TV. TV has simultaneous process of many things going on, and because of that, people need to watch all the things that are happening. Whereas, baseball is a one thing at a time. I mean, it's literally a kind of byproduct of alphabetacy and the printed word, in a way that football is a resonance with the electric word. It's a resonance with the simultaneity and the much at onceness. I think part of what you could say there is that, yeah, a hot medium is well suited to completed products, whereas a cool medium is well suited to ongoing processes. Iron Chef and cooking shows, they're not going to play really well on radio. That is, radio doesn't have, it only has this one thing at a time in a very hot way. It doesn't have this participative, many items from which you could select as your attention is unfolding. Okay, I think part of the thing here too is that for McLuhan, as I said before, even though he talks about a given media as hot or cool, and he does right now suggest that we're in the middle of a reversal, an implosion and a cooling down of the Western heat up. So for thousands of years, Western culture was expanding and heating up through the expansion and development of literacy, and it went from, the alphabet to the written word up into the printing press. And the printing press is the overheated medium. This is when culture was becoming more and more fragmented, more and more separated off in separate functions, made in the image of alphabetacy and ultimately of the printed word, of one thing at a time, seriality, linearity. And when the telegraph hit, it was the beginning of the implosion, the beginning of the reversal. Now, even though radio is still hot and it comes before TV, it's part of the implosion because it's radio is hot, but it's cooler than the printed word. And so let's see if we can get to that. Um, it's as if for McLuhan, if you're a highly literate society, you you have a kind of immunity to radio, although it does bring out a kind of guilt that was being hidden in the culture. That before a kind of robust individualism that the book fosters, this sort of each person for themselves, and it was kind of a private enterprise is the logic. Each person is concerned with, I don't want to say themselves, but the book is a private, isolated activity, and it promotes private goals, private long-term goals. And suddenly, when radio hits, some of those private goals start to engender a kind of unlocalized guilt feeling in people. By the time then you get to and also this for McLuhan, wholly oral peoples don't have an immunity against radio in a way that highly literate ones do. So wholly oral societies, radio can create a kind of tribalizing frenzy. It does, because it amplifies the sense of sound. It has this kind of tribalizing capacity. Whereas in a highly literate society, I think they can use it somewhat as entertainment. On the other side of this, though, what McLuhan would say is as people become more and more drenched the um, in the electric age, and in particularly in radio, some of those immunities to the effects of radio and its tribalizing force, they get lessened, and so people become more and more tribalized by radio. Um, TV is much cooler than radio for McLuhan, right? TV is a cool medium. It um, it challenges long-term goals. Let me try to one last way, and then I'll maybe let this go, and we'll call that today's installment on McLuhan. And please check out McLuhan. But think about the difference between movie stars and TV stars. For McLuhan, movies are hot, and movie stars they're like larger than life. They're almost cut to a certain dimension where we can imagine them sort of super drawn out, and there's a real difference between a movie star's character role and the real person. That is, people don't ever confuse those, and when they write letters to the actor, they're interested in the actual life of the actor. When you move to TV stars often play themselves. They don't have a wide difference between the character that they're playing and themselves, right? It's almost like they're typecast because on TV you have to be cooler, right? A film star can be very hot, well defined. Generally, beautiful women play really well in movies, whereas your sort of everyday person plays well on TV, partly because TV is a cool medium. And people oftentimes, TV stars, they can receive letters from fans that are written to the character. Like, if you go to Seinfeld, I mean, George Costanza receives letters to George Costanza, right? Not to Jason Alexander. I don't think that, try to think of a star. Who's the guy who plays, I don't know, whatever. So some movie star, Harrison Ford, he's not getting letters to Indiana Jones. I think that it just doesn't make any sense. At any rate, if you have not read Understanding Media, get a copy. This is a master work. You will be utterly surprised at what you find there. If you haven't read it in a while, go give it another look. It's amazing. It is the centennial of McLuhan. We're trying to celebrate. Please, that was just first 2 chapters out of 33. It's a mind-blowing book. Okay, thanks.